You're listening to episode 197 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Jacob Hess joins us to speak about applying a Buddhist-originated mindfulness practice with a Mormon community. Hi everyone. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to remind the listeners that we've started a new podcast which may also interest you. It's called Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science, and appears every other week, alternating with The Secular Buddhist. You'll find many of the same guests you've enjoyed and learned from here, as well as new researchers, teachers, and practitioners. You'll find Present Moment in the Science and Medicine section of iTunes in Natural Sciences, or just do an iTunes Store search for mindfulness and look in the results in the podcast section. You can also visit the website, presentmomentmindfulness.com. Thanks for checking it out, and if you like what you hear, please feel free to share it with others. Whether you think of it as a watering down of Buddhism or not, mindfulness is mainstreaming. And like a secular approach to the tradition, it's finding that this opens doors which would otherwise remain closed. I had an opportunity recently to speak with a fellow mindfulness educator and hear more about how he's taking the practice to an audience we might not think of as being as interested, accepting, and eager for it as they are. Perhaps their openness can be an example to others. Jacob Hess is co-founder of All of Life. He holds a doctorate degree in clinical community psychology from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and was a psychology department valedictorian at Brigham Young University. He has recently worked as research director at Utah Youth Village, a nonprofit for abused children in Utah. Jacob has authored 13 peer-reviewed articles and 2 books, including a new exploration of American romance. He is married to Monique Moore and has one 22-month-old boy who makes sure his daddy smiles at least 9 times a day. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Tazo orange tea. Our guest today is Jacob Hess. Jacob, welcome to The Secular Buddhist.
Hi, Ted. Thanks for having me.
Very nice to speak with you again, my friend. And before we get started, I want to have a shout out to our friend Debbie, who is one of your partners in your efforts in bringing mindfulness to your local community. Hi, Debbie. We're thinking about you. So, Jacob, before we get going on a few different topics that we want to cover today, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, in particular your religious tradition and how that ties to your meditation practice?
You bet. I'm a homegrown Utah Mormon, and I have family cross the plains, get kicked out of Illinois after Joseph Smith was killed. My grandfather, who was Joseph's bodyguard, my namesake died on the Pioneer Trail out here, so my roots run deep in Mormonism. And perhaps something unique about Mormons is that as we go out and get higher education, for the most part, statistically speaking, our religiosity remains. So there isn't the same kind of decrease in faith among most Mormons when they go out into the bigger world. When I was 19, I went down to Brazil for 2 years, learned Portuguese, spent some transformative years with the people of the Bahia, the northeast coast, Black Africa. And I was changed certainly more than I ever helped anyone else change down there. Alcohol controls a lot of the culture. So you have people with very little money and with these huge addictions. So we would work with families and trying to help kind of restore a sense of family and connection, sharing and teaching the gospel of Christ as we understand it, but really just seeking to serve and to help. And I came home very touched by that experience. Afterwards, I graduated from BYU in psychology, went out to the University of Illinois. And if I thought Brazil was foreign, I found myself surrounded by an ultra-liberal psychology doctoral program at the University of Illinois, and I felt in a very foreign environment, and I didn't know if I could share what I believed. I was in diversity classes where I didn't feel like I could really show up.
Which is really interesting, it being a diversity class and you can't share your diversity.
Right, and so I had a lot of those questions initially. What eventually happened was I lost a brother the second year of graduate school to cancer, and he was very close to me, and I was his bone marrow donor for his cancer treatment. And through the course of that, my graduate community came to support me in amazing ways, and I just felt so held and loved by them that my relationships really changed, and I felt able to share myself with them. And ultimately, I was invited to co-facilitate a liberal conservative dialogue class at the University of Illinois. We had 10 conservative students, 10 liberal students, and they would come together and vote on topics to talk about and select ground rules. And for many of them, it was the first time they'd ever had a conversation with somebody who disagreed with them deeply that was enjoyable. And, we would teach them things like sitting with their discomfort and, things that are very familiar to mindfulness community. And it was transformative for them and for me. My dissertation chair was my lesbian professor. And the whole experience was just hugely transforming. My lesbian professor, dear friend Wendy, sent me out to Massachusetts and said, you need to attend this conference. I attended the research conference out of the University of Massachusetts Center for Mindfulness, and I fell in love. I describe it almost like I'm seeing mindfulness across the room and locking eyes, and I was smitten, and the love affair has not stopped. I felt a level of peace with these mindfulness people, many of whom had some connection to Buddhism. I felt a level of peace that was unique there. And I've shared about that experience many times with my Mormon friends, telling them, here are these people with bumper stickers that say, what would Buddha do? And lighten up. And I felt so at home, so comfortable, so touched by what I would call the spirit. I felt the same kind of spirit of truth there that I had come to love in my home faith. Joseph Smith taught that truth tastes good. And from the beginning, as I experienced mindfulness, I just knew it was something huge. So I remain a student, very much a rookie, and not just in the sense of, the Dalai Lama saying he practices with the beginner's mind. I mean, like really beginner's mind. I feel like this is a lifetime study.
Jacob, was that your first experience with meditation practices with a scientific conference?
Yes, it was. And that was in 2006. And I remained a student, more of an academic, intellectual exploration. I did my dissertation on Prozac and different narratives of depression. And I found in mindfulness a nice counterpoint to the dominant narrative of our culture of how to treat depression. So initially it was like, instead of trying to make it go away, chemically or otherwise, here's a sophisticated, thoughtful way of relating to emotion in a way that can actually allow it to activate, That's what I spent a number of years just being intrigued by. Like, this is so refreshing. It's so different than both the let's give you something to make this depression or anxiety go away, and hey, just choose to be happy, just have some faith. you know it eventually led me into taking an MBSR class here in Salt Lake City. Unlike other places in the country, we have one almost certified teacher. I mean, there's very sparse offerings. I relished my experience with Vicky Overfelt in her class, and it's changed my life in 100 ways. It's changed how I relate to my Mormon faith. It's changed how I relate to my wife, who sits with me. And we've only just begun, to quote Karen Carpenter. So I love this conversation, and I sit regularly in the mornings, and my wife sits when the baby lets her sit, and we dream of going to a couples retreat one day for an anniversary, but that's some of my background.
You'll get there eventually. So out of that practice, you had these two very, let's say, different rooted, but not necessarily conflictive branches to your background, your religious faith, and a mindfulness practice that came from an entirely different tradition. And out of that grew something that you'd told me about when you and I first met, called Mindfully Mormon. Tell us about how that started. What's the background there?
Well, as I became exposed to mindfulness, naturally I began to explore my own faith from what I'd been exposed to. The experience that I had tasting the practice of Vipassana meditation and led me to see the scriptures that I grew up studying, and the prophets and all the tradition with a different lens. And I started to notice things like, isn't it interesting that Joseph was more inclined to meditate than read? He was into deep pondering. And isn't it interesting how often the word meditation comes up in Christian scripture? And why is it that when I settle deeply into Vipassana practice, I feel closer to God? And why is it that so many Christians around me feel so far from anything resembling peace? Even in the saddle Christians, and I use Christians to refer to Mormons as well, although many Christians would pick a fight about that, and I'm fine with that. There's different views of Christians, and I don't, we see Christ quite differently than Orthodox Christianity, and this is relevant to your question in that Mormons do not believe in the depravity of man. One reason that there is some conflict between us and Orthodox Christians is we believe we're literal children of God in the Spirit, and that we're not depraved. Rather, that we're living in a world that is impinging on us and fallen and corrupt. And I actually resonate with the Buddhist language about dwelling in delusion and having to wake up, And it's worth mentioning, the more I studied Prozac and the pharmaceutical industry's control on the narrative of depression, it's not hard to see a world that is really, however we want to call it, deluded, fallen, or just, my atheist co-author Phil would just call it, commodified and controlled by capital. They all kind of feel the same to me. It's kind of like a world where really wonderful, beautiful people get stuck. They get stuck in their bodies and minds and hearts. And in the practice of mindfulness meditation, I see almost a universal path that, especially when delivered in a secular language, is super accessible to almost anyone. And in the context of my Mormon community, interestingly enough, that's how I need to present it to them, because if I present it with all the religious trappings, it's very hard for them to receive.
Yeah, and it's much easier when this is something that it's based on our shared humanity. That makes it open to all of us, and we can set aside the ideological differences that we may have and still honor and respect those that, yes, we're going to have differences. We've got different backgrounds. That's okay. This is based on us being people and how we interact as people.
Exactly. Beautifully said, Ted. This is slightly might be out of the direct question, but after graduate school, I was invited by Phil Neisser, a professor at Potsdam, State University of New York in Potsdam. He's a political science chair. He invited me to write a book with him. He'd always wanted to do a book on conversations that liberals and conservatives needed to have. Phil and I spent 2 years talking about all our differences, the very kinds of things that we get hung up on: religion, morality, power, race, homosexuality. And the reason I mention that now is I started that conversation really thinking that that's what mattered. Those differences, and I started graduate school thinking that, can I even be friends? We disagree on such huge issues. And the end of graduate school and finishing that book, it was so utterly clear that what united me and Phil, who is an atheist leftist professor from New York, what united us was so much more important than what divides us. And we still disagree vociferously about everything. So our book is called You're Not as Crazy as I Thought, but You're Still Wrong. Conversations between a devoted conservative and a diehard liberal. He's one of my best friends. I count it as a miracle in my life that I love this man so much and we have this relationship. And when I tell other religious people in my community, look, let's stop listening to what Fox News has to say about the liberals and actually sit down and hear their hearts. They're not out to destroy America. There are very different views out there, and let's relish the difference and find, anyway, this is a long way to get back to your point. There's a common humanity that is exquisite and totally overlooked in a media that is throwing flame bombs at each other, and we get caught up in that. But if we sit down and really hear each other out, this emerges. And so that's why I bring in the dialogue, because in dialogue, I see a kind of mindful practice where you're sitting with somebody you disagree with and you're holding a space and you practice together really hearing each other out. So the dialogue and the mindfulness practice are very closely linked for me, and they've both led to great change.
Well, tell us more about that dialogue. Tell us about how that's gone. Let's dive for a few minutes in the book You're Not as Crazy as I Thought. And for folks listening, I will be linking this book will be available on the episode page for this episode. So let's talk about that for a few minutes. The thing that was most important to you that came out of this, and this is a change for you, it sounds like, is where you shared.
Yeah, and it wasn't on my radar before how much we did share. I mean, it's not too hard to assume we don't share a lot at all. You hear a lot of talk about two Americas and secular America and religious America or whatever. And it was a bit dumbfounding to realize how much bedrock there was right under our feet to work with. And that includes every issue. That includes LGBT rights, that includes abortion, that includes very difficult dialogues about domestic violence and pornography. But I would say the takeaway for me was that just like in meditation, you cannot deliver conceptually to people what they're actually going to get out of it. You can't say it to them. In dialogue, there's also a nonverbal thing that happens when you sit with a wide open heart, with a primary focus on understanding. And I would just describe that as the opposite of demonization. There's a humanization that happens where you can no longer treat, quote, the liberals
in a bucket
as some band that all fit that exact way that Bill O'Reilly talks about them. I'm revolted by how the stereotypes I hear now. And I regularly say something like, in a conversation with my fellow conservative neighbors, yeah, I really also disagree with what President Obama is doing there. But I think I disagree with you that I don't think he's a liar. And I don't think he's trying to hurt America. I actually think he has a really different perspective on what America needs. I wonder what those differences are. That's the kind of thing that has arisen for me. It's very easy to see, but not easy to see for many conservatives. It's very easy to go to the malevolent accusations, Obama is doing this. I disagree with him, and he's lying to me, and he wants to hurt America. I mean, you don't know how often I hear that. So I'm passionate about liberal conservative dialogue. There was actually just a transpartisan dialogue listserv that was launched because we need to counteract those cultural forces that would kind of set us at odds. And again, I bring this up, Ted, during our call because it's almost, for me, it's mindful communication. It's two people practicing this very hard thing together. And believe me, there are some people that just do not want to do this. It's challenging. So
yeah, it's how do we shift from our habit reflex of antagonism into exploration in shared dialogue? And that's a very hard leap for all of us to make.
yes, it absolutely is. And this is going to sound funny, but my mother-in-law is a Fox News conservative, and I certainly am not. When I got married, we really struggled to talk with each other. In fact, I sort of get along and talk with liberals much easier these days than really absolutist people. So I sat down with my mother-in-law, and I did exactly what we encourage people to do in the book, which is sit down with somebody that you'd like to talk with and set up some ground rules and ask each other, what do you need to feel completely comfortable in this conversation? And what do I need? And create some guidelines, including a commitment to seek understanding first. And for me, those guidelines are really important. We use them in our class. I use them with individuals that are difficulty, and just kind of an explicit statement of what different people need to be able to talk. And I find, and I'm actually fond of Gadamer's depiction of this, he's a German philosopher. He argues that the capacity for dialogue is built into everyone. And the fact that it's hard for us says more to me about the culture we live in than necessarily about some inner, I just can't do this. No, I am a believer that we've got a capacity to seek understanding and to be okay with difference and to sit with difference and to coexist across difference. But we've been socialized out of it. I mean, we've been really taught well. It sounds really funny, but most conservatives I know have not spent significant time really hearing out an actual living in the flesh liberal. It's a lot easier just to check out what others are saying about those liberals, and it may be easier for liberals to read what the Huffington Post says about those conservatives or whatever. So our invitation is to I'm a part of an organization called Living Room Conversations, and the invitation is to get a co-host, somebody who disagrees with you about something, and it doesn't have to be along the religious divide or the political divide, but just any issue. And then each of you invites two people into the conversation, and you have a living room conversation. You spend an evening together. You break bread. I did this in New York with Phil, and I invited a Catholic layman and a Christian pastor. He invited two heathen professors. And I just jokingly use that term. It was beautiful. We talked about gay marriage. That actually led to the This American Life broadcast. It was beautiful. I can just tell you, if I had my way, I'd be doing these all the time. And on my birthday, my wife jokes with me because I like to do a dialogue night where I have friends over. It's an art, and it's the same kind of beauty I see in the practice. It's just with others, and it's similar kinds of challenges. So
I'd say one of those challenges that you've probably run into yourself in dialoguing, because I also share that interest in trying to understand other points of view better, because I don't understand them. It's just an honest acknowledgement of my own limitations, is that it's not necessarily about changing someone else's mind, but having a better understanding of why people have different views. Why did they land in a different place than I did? Because it doesn't make sense to me. That's not a bad thing. That's simply an acknowledgement of our own limitations and our different backgrounds and different experience, that just having that understanding is in itself beneficial because it, I think, helps reduce the prevalence we see in antagonism in our culture today.
Beautiful. I couldn't agree more. Precisely what you said, Ted. It's intuitive, perhaps, to people who are in this work, but it's really not intuitive to most people. And one objection we've heard from a lot of people is, what is the point? You know, if we walk away from the focus on converting others, convincing others, and persuading others as our first priority, it feels to many people like we're not doing anything, or if we're not focused on getting something done. By contrast, I hear you saying that, and this is again, I'll channel Gadamer. He argues that when we sit with somebody and we bring together the intense diversity of backgrounds, his language is that there is an event of understanding. There's something that happens in that event, that a third understanding arises that neither party brought with them. And my own experience, again, just speaking from my practice of dialogue, is this intangible, nonverbal transformation, shift in my heart towards Phil, towards Wendy, and towards so many others happened as we spoke. Recently in Salt Lake City, mid-level leaders of the LDS Church got together with some LGBT activist leaders at the Pride Center, and they settled on a location where they could meet, and they kept it secret because sometimes these things can be sensitive. And over the course of months of dialogue, they reached an understanding that led the LDS Church to come out in support of a gay rights Salt Lake County ordinance, and totally baffled. I mean, it surprised so many people. It didn't surprise me when I found out what had happened. So the point being, if we do this work and do this practice, not only does it soften hearts, but it can lead to actual actions, joint actions, and things that we can do together or that we won't do together if that understanding isn't there.
And we would never have those if we didn't even sit down and have the dialogue and try to understand.
Absolutely. I've seen the opposite. I've seen a domestic violence coalition break up because the Catholic healthcare providers would refuse to talk with the Planned Parenthood folks because of abortion differences. So we can't work together on fighting battering of women because of these other misunderstandings. So in my mind, it's like sitting in silence, focusing on our breath. It's supremely practical. It has everything to do with actual real life. But on the surface, it looks like a waste of time. Really, like really sitting in silence, really? And listening and trying to understand, what a waste of time.
So let's shift a little bit back actually to Mindfully Mormon and the growth of that. What started that, and what is it for folks who are listening?
Mindfully Mormon is my own blog where I just needed to start to explore some of the interface between my faith of origin and my newfound faith, I'm going to call it, in this practice. And both very alive for me, both very real. And what I found is a dialogue between traditions that is just mind-blowing in its beauty for me. And I will read scriptures, verses that I've read for a long time, and I'm seeing completely different things because of my experience with contemplative practice and some of the writings. And I'm such a rookie in the latter that I'm reading on all these different authors now. And so it's a blog, and eventually I'm working on a book, Mindfully Mormon. And I would say it's two invitations in one, Ted. For my Mormon community, Mindfully Mormon is an invitation to open themselves up to the truth that can be found in other traditions. Joseph Smith taught, and Brigham Young also taught this, that a fundamental principle of Mormonism is to accept truth from whatever source it comes. Brigham said, whether it comes from the Catholics, the Baptists, the philosophers, the scientists, or hell itself, wherever truth exists, Brigham said, we ought to claim it and embrace it. That's the quote I always pull out whenever I sense resistance. Like, well, wait a minute, is this in the scriptures? So, Christians have a bad habit of that. Is it in the Bible? Then I'm not going to listen. Or is it in the scriptures, or is it for us? Is it something that the church has produced? And certainly, the spirit of Mormonism, as I understand it, is a radical openness to truth wherever it exists. And I'm inviting my Mormon community to practice that and to walk and to open themselves up, because we're suffering in our community in similar ways to the whole American community. To the non-Mormon community, I would also like to invite them to see us as Mormons through a different set of lenses. Don't evaluate us all like Mitt Romney lookalikes, or just eager to knock on your door and come tell you something and try to convince you of something. There is something in Mormonism that, as people experience us and allow themselves to get to know us, is non-threatening, is compromising, meaning like open to make adjustments. And the church right now, I'm proud of how the church is trying to make a really thoughtful discussion around something like LGBT rights. They're not just trying to shove it away. So I hope for a more nuanced conversation also about our place in the world, and not wanting it to be an aggressive place, a hostile place, but wanting to be a player in public discussions from a very loving place. So I'd like to see both those conversations happen.
So what are some of the questions you've been getting from your religious community about meditation practices? What are the things that come up most for them?
There are different kinds of meditation. And I think most people I've run into have a view of meditation that has been informed by the clear your mind and don't have any thoughts kind of meditation. When you look for a picture of meditation, you can't really find anything that doesn't have people holding their hands in certain ways.
Sitting in a bendy position.
Like literally, you can't find them. I've looked for pictures of meditation where people aren't doing their hand thing, which I never do because I don't really know why, but you can't find them. So the perception of meditation is a little weird. Why would we do that? We have prayer. We ponder and we pray. So why would we need to meditate? So some of them, I think, see it as redundant with our religious practice, and others certainly as a threat. Both of those concerns, they melt away when people have a chance to talk. My main approach, Ted, has been, and I'm reflecting now, one reason those questions haven't come up as much is I'm approaching this from more of a secular approach. Most of the conversations I have about meditation are, hey, you're suffering, you're hurting. And like, I noticed that you're in you just look in a state of hyper arousal. My neighbor down the street, he just looks weighed down, he's a father, he has children. And so I find it a lot easier to just go right there and like, this is something that can help. And then the religious questions come up more incidentally, like, well, is this a threat to my faith? Well, no, let's talk about that. And a number of our prophets, we believe in modern prophets, just like, Moses was a prophet in the Bible. We believe prophecy continues, and not just for formal prophets, but I think I see a number of individuals who are sharing truth. I kind of see them as prophetic figures. I told John Kabat-Zinn at his retreat that I jokingly tell people in Utah he's the 13th apostle. And I'm not really joking. I feel like John has done a huge service in bringing a very safe form of this that is so much more accessible to my community than a version that gets a lot into the Dharma. And even I will admit, even myself, when I hear people talk more explicitly about the Dharma, there are sticking points for me. There are things about the Dharma that I don't embrace. And there are other things that are lovely and beautiful, but
me too. and as someone who identifies as a Buddhist, I still have those sticking points. And there's variation within our populace about how much is it going to be every single point? Well, no. And that's how things change and grow. And we adapt to them or they adapt to us. But there is a living engagement with this and a living dialogue. And that shows how vital it is, how alive it is.
Cool. I'm relishing this dialogue. If I may, Ted, my belief is that this mindfulness movement is happening not just by chance. I believe the world is changing in very deliberate ways, not with some puppeteer behind it all, but certainly with a power greater than myself overseeing some of the beautiful things that are happening. When I attend my dialogue conference, I just feel this thrill, this energy. And they're a small group. It's just like the mindfulness community. It's still a pretty small group over the earth. C.S. Lewis has this beautiful quote that I want to actually apply to the mindfulness community. He calls Christians a rebel force that is spreading over the earth, preparing for a new day when, we could say when capital doesn't rule the world, when people are allowed to be in their bodies and actually like breathe and stop and not be driven by these forces outside of themselves. I feel like the far-flung community of mindfulness could be described as a rebel force spreading over the earth to prepare it for a much better day. And I joked about that at our retreat, but I really wasn't joking. There are big things that have to change in this earth if we're going to have a time of peace. And I see mindfulness teachers as peace brokers in the best sense of the word. My joke at the retreat, since I mentioned it, is when Jesus comes again, and I definitely believe he is coming. When Jesus comes, I wouldn't be surprised if he sends people to mindfulness teachers and says, let's get your body and your nervous system cooled down. Let's detox you from the 5 medications you're on and help you like get back in your body and get in a place where you can actually receive truth again.
Let's explore this a little bit. You and Debbie, that I mentioned earlier, are co-facilitating an MBSR program. And what are some of the things that you are learning out of that? Are there any surprises for you that you weren't expecting? Or what are some of the challenges that you're facing right now?
Oh, the surprise for me, Ted, is how beautiful the people are. I mean, I love people. I like my neighbors. But when I sit with this gal in our class who's had 70 surgeries and who drags herself to class and is in so much pain that the body scan is almost like torture initially, but instead of not practicing it, she does it 3 times a day. As I sit in this room and just sit in silence with them, their beauty is overwhelming. It's almost like looking at a big landscape on the mountain. We live next to the mountains and just seeing this beautiful vista. There really is intense beauty in people. I'm not romanticizing suffering at all. Just people themselves in their inherent humanity, as you described it. It's really lovely. And when you see them allowed and invited to have an opportunity to be courageous and practice and turn towards what they've been avoiding and medicating and numbing out to. I mean, oh my goodness, and the kinds of comments that people make, it's super clear that we cannot teach on our own as teachers. What needs to happen, it's a drawing out, like being a midwife of their own beautiful, this thing that they are birthing, and we're just there kind of to help them draw it out. I think that is the root word of education, to draw out. So that has been surprising. It's something I heard about in the MBSR training, but in practice, it just blows me away. And so it's very humbling. It's crazy how unprepared and how clear it is that it's a lifetime of practice ahead of me. Let me just say that.
But how wonderfully inspiring to be able to be part of that and to learn from others who are in these very different places than we are ourselves. And yet we get to soak that in and energize ourselves with it.
Amen, Brother Ted.
So let's shift a little bit to another area that you work with, all of life. You and I had a conversation a bit about depression and some of the concerns that you and I share about this. Tell us about your work with all of life and what that is.
You bet. When I did my dissertation at the University of Illinois, I interviewed people and just asked them their experiences with depression and just to tell me their story. And the real takeaway from all these interviews I did in Illinois and in Utah was how interesting it was that the story of depression they told me, it sounded a lot like this. My brain has a chemical deficiency, and I will always have this chemical deficiency, and I'm just going to need to deal with it, cope with it, and manage it for the rest of my life. And yeah, it sucks that I have all these side effects, and but this is who I am. So, if the science confirmed that story, if this is actually what neuroscientists were telling us, A, the depressed brain has a permanent deficiency. B, the natural course of outcomes for depression is lifelong trajectory. You can just, once you get it, it's just like that.
You're done.
Type 1 diabetes, sorry, it's just going to be you. If that's what the science was saying, then I'd be all about telling people that, Ted. But it's not. And I've studied with some fantastic scientists in a top 5 psychology program, and you know what the science says. The science is crazy optimistic about people's possibilities as they make some adjustments and do some different things. And by golly, wow, your brain is actually going to change over time. My fascination, and the reason we started All of Life, is that nobody knows about that. At least not in my community. There's so little awareness of brain changeability. There's so little awareness that there's actually 10,000 risk factor studies. When you search depression and risk factors, the medical literature is full of little lifestyle adjustments that have been correlated with this low state of mood. So the natural question is, well, why don't people know that? And it's not really, you don't have to look very far to realize where people are learning this stuff. They're learning it in the commercials between the nightly news. They're learning it from community education classes that are funded by pharmaceutical companies. Most of our mental health education in the country is funded by pharmaceutical companies. That's just a fact. Senator Grassley from Iowa forced one of the major mental health education organizations to disclose their budget a number of years ago. 75% of their budget was coming from pharmaceutical companies. WebMD, which is the top repository of health information that people go to, funded by Eli Lilly. The point is that, I'm not against drugs. I really am not. If people want to use some medications to help with something, great. What we are opposed to is drug money also doing the education of our minds about what these things are. So our mission as an organization is to broaden the conversation about mental health and aim for education that is industry independent and that just looks at the broad picture. I was at a conference in Chicago on ADHD, and the psychiatrist presenting was talking about some of the long-term effects of Ritalin. At the end of the presentation, somebody raised their hand and said, well, if we don't put these ADHD kids on Ritalin, then what are we going to do? And this old psychiatrist with white hair, you could tell he'd had a lot of experience. He had this shocked look on his face with the question. So again, the question, if we don't put the kids on the ADHD kids on Ritalin, what are we going to do? And his response was, all of life. I mean, nutrition and nature and relationships and exercise. And, in other words, have we lost our imagination at all the things that can help shape our minds and our hearts and our bodies and our families and our relationships? And the answer, in my opinion, Ted, is yes, we have lost a lot of our imagination. Speaking for the American public, we've bought the message, and most people, 90% of people I talk with who have a family member or themselves struggle with mental health problems, know little to nothing about brain changeability, know almost nothing about mindfulness, and think exercise can maybe sort of help, but not really because they've got a brain deficiency. So they're just going to have to cope with it.
Yeah, one of the tragic things that I see about this is the two polar ends of this are the lack of awareness around self-directed neuroplasticity, that we have the capability of making incremental, granted it's not overnight, there does need to be patience and it is hard work, there's effort involved, but that there are studies which indicate, hey, there's some benefit here. This may be of help to you, so that you aren't necessarily stuck in a pharmacological treatment regime and always being depressed or always having the suffering from the other effects of the medications you're on. So there's that end of it that's just based on not knowing, and there are things that we may do that may help. And then I see also some of the dangers on the other side, where folks who go to a retreat, for example, and they do have a positive experience, and they make a very innocent, however, perhaps somewhat uninformed decision to suddenly drop their medications that their neurochemistry is kind of leaning on in perhaps not the most prudent change. Maybe that also needs to be taken with some careful consideration and exploration. And it doesn't mean that you can't make a change. It does mean that you might not want to make that all at once in an imprudent fashion. You do need to exercise some caution on both ends of that spectrum, but that you can make some changes with some practice.
You're right on. And if I could riff off of you, the tapering process, there's research behind it now. It is best done not when you're making other big changes. It should be done on its own time when other things are settled and with support and very gradually. And I like how you kind of emphasize the patience involved in both. Often when people go to the doctor and say, I'd like to taper, they cut their dosage in half.
Which is huge.
Which is huge, yes. And there's actually a Harvard psychiatrist that's written really beautifully, tragically, about how that kind of drop, it leads to such severe withdrawal effects that it is no wonder people come away saying, oh, the depression is back. Clearly, I need this medication more than I realized, and I need to go right back on. When actually the withdrawal effects, if you manage them in a very mindful way, and that can include supplements to help kind of, neutralize some withdrawal effects, and coming down at 10% decrements, one drug at a time with enough support, and if their withdrawal effects are too much, you go up. So all I'm saying is absolutely it needs to be very thoughtful. And this idea that, we just make a little lifestyle shift and then the depression's going to be fine. I've heard stories about nutritional counselors who will say, we're just going to shift and have a lot of amino acids and vitamin D and stuff, and your depression will be fine. No, it really has to be a whole life, an all of life approach. And just meditating alone or just starting to change your diet alone, I mean, this depression stuff is serious business. And so that's why we advocate for looking at anything that the research literature has shown. And on our website, if you go into the research tab under Lit Review, we've actually looked at the medical literature and come up with a questionnaire based on all the many factors. And our feeling is that if people are exposed to all the different things that contribute, then they can create their own plan based on their own needs. That's a long-term plan to kind of move their brain, their body, in another direction. And that can be done for ADHD. We have an ADHD questionnaire. We have a depression questionnaire. We actually call them awareness instruments, because all it is like exposing people to all the different options they have.
Yeah, and understanding that we're all unique in our experiences, in our neurological makeup, in our chemistry of our bodies, so that, it's going to maybe take some time, some effort, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to this. With that in mind, start exploring what some of those options might be.
That's right. And if I could add one more thing, Ted. Our focus is to just make sure people at least have a story that supports what you're saying. I mean, long term, that's exactly what needs to happen. In the short term, people just need hope that their life can actually not suck. And I'm speaking with all seriousness. I interviewed a 20-year-old girl who told me that her suicidal thoughts started the day that her doctor told her that her depression would be lifelong. That's the moment that she started thinking about killing herself. Anyway, I can go off. There are other stories of people who have actually taken their lives after deciding that there's no hope for recovery. So this for me is a life and death issue. And we have an online class. It's a 6-hour online class on our website. We've interviewed 35 different professionals, including 15 or so mindfulness teachers. And we're just trying to get industry independent, high quality science-based education out there. And it's also secular, of course. We want it to be accessible to anyone and just broaden the conversation so that people with mental health problems are not framed as these different kind of human beings with brains that don't work and that we all pity them. That's an awful story to put on anyone, especially somebody who already feels awful.
Absolutely. So turning things to a lighter vein, let's chat for just a few minutes. You have another book that's just come out. Tell us about that.
I'm in a culture where marriage is, we talk about marriage a lot, and I just could not figure out how to get there. I really struggled to know how to do this whole lifelong commitment thing. Is very hard and lots of painful experiences. And it was a hard time of my life. So I did what researchers do when they're faced with hard things. I just started interviewing and asking questions to people and writing down what they said. And so at the end of this long autoethnography project, I'd collected nearly 100 interviews and I just wrote up my results. So the book is called Once Upon a Time, He Wasn't Feeling It Anymore. And there's a Kindle edition and a hard copy edition on Amazon. But the bottom line for me is it sounds a lot similar to what we've already talked about, Ted, but there are these beautiful people that meet each other and really like each other and feel attracted to each other. And they start to spend time together and they have all the possibility in the world of having a lovely long-term commitment until you saddle that relationship with this story of what true love is. And I would say, the American story, is when you've met the person that is your true love, when you've found true love, you will feel this, fill in the blank. And I don't have to fill in the blank. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. It's like this head over feels reverential this adoration of this person, this knock your socks off, incredible feeling that lasts, that doesn't ebb and flow. It doesn't go away. True love, it lasts. So the pattern that I see over and over is people having these amazing experiences and then suddenly I'm not feeling it. And so when the feeling dies, of course, the love is over. And very little attention to the cyclical patterns that feelings go through and the nature of love itself as something more than a feeling and transcending a feeling and even incorporating moments where the feeling settles. And so the book, one of the take homes of the book is that when the feeling settles in a romantic relationship, that may very well be an opportunity to show more love for your partner rather than less, rather than running away. It may actually be a chance to show more love when the relationship is not as selfish as it used to be. In other words, you're not being automatically just fulfilled, right, by the honeymoon stage of a relationship. Can you, when the feeling settles, still love that person and show them that their needs matter to you? For couples that truly love each other, that's the question they have to answer. And I see many couples say yes. My mother had chemotherapy until she was an old woman. And her body, I know that it just changed everything about their relationship. But I saw my father love her more, not less. He didn't walk away just because the romance was certainly different and perhaps even not there.
And what an opportunity of growing for him as well. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from this is it's not ways to falsely keep things going with baling wire and duct tape. It's about growing yourself, and that in turn enriches the relationship.
Exactly. There is always a time to walk away. In fact, when there's abuse involved or aggression, this is not about making all relationships work. It's about preserving, and it's about preserving a space where couples with real potential can last and not run away from each other just when the feeling thermometer goes down. It's not anti-romance. This is pro-romance. It's pro-lifelong romance, And I'm so tired of seeing amazing individuals run away from each other, and drag each other through the gutter. And this happens across all lines, it happens across religious lines and political and sexual orientation. Couples are, we're suffering. And I think we're suffering for some of the same reasons that we suffer in other issues. We take this story literally and we download it and then we live it out. And we don't just tell the story, we live the story.
We breathe life into it and make it a thing that it really doesn't deserve.
And it crushes us. It crushes relationships. And I've heard that over and over. So what would it mean to flirt with another love story? A love story that is very consistent with mindful practice. A love story where we acknowledge the ebb and flow of emotionality and we allow people to be people. It's a love story that is just not even a story. It's just allowing things to be as they really are rather than forcing our relationships to conform with the bachelor and the bachelorette.
So for folks who've been listening to the podcast, I will be putting links to Jacob's books on the page, as well as to the sites mindfullymormon.org and alloflife.org. Our guest today, Jacob Hess. Jacob, thank you for being here.
Ted, it was a delight. I find you just thrilling to talk with. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.